Hi, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having this session. It's really nice to meet you. I'm Clea Harrelson. I'm a PhD student in the anthropology department at the University of Maine. I study coastal communities and fisheries. I'm talking about a project today that I did in part with the Canadian Lobster Research Network as part of a remote internship. And I worked with a few other folks that names keep coming up everywhere, Joelle, for instance. And also Diana Bourbono and Cecilia Perez Plancarte from the CLRN. And so what we were trying to do together is talk about the landscape of social science, focused on lobstering and focused on Atlantic Canada and Maine. So what's happening in this space? I'll start with failure at the clicker. I know. No clicker. That's okay. Can we go to the next slide? Sure. Thanks. I'll try again when I'm feeling lucky mid-presentation. Oh, okay. Yay, okay. We'll start with a little bit of context and a little bit about the research questions and motivation for this. And then there's really two main parts of the work that I'm going to talk about today. One, we did a systematic literature review to understand what social science exists for these spaces and in these time periods. And then I also did a survey of active social science folks who are answering questions related to the lobstering industries of this region. So those are the kind of research pieces, and I'll talk a little bit about how I'm viewing this in terms of future research potential and next steps for myself. This is kind of preaching to the fisheries choir. We know there's been change. Everyone said this like all morning, right? There's constant change and long histories of change. And the people who use marine space in this area, the way the environments have changed over not just decades, but millennia. And I'd like to just argue as part of this presentation that the scientific landscapes, like the way that we generate knowledge about these spaces and these people, is another angle that's worthy of inquiry. Right? We have some internal reflection to do of how are we setting up infrastructure? How are we talking about the systems, the institutions, the organizations that have drawn us all together here, but that really have deep impacts for the future of how we know and understand lobster fishing in the Northwest Atlantic. So that's kind of where this came from. And it came from the space of me sitting in a lot of lobster meetings, like the US-Canada Town Hall, some opportunities through the CLRN, and people standing up and saying, hey, I feel really disconnected from social science research. Like, I don't understand how it relates to my fishing practice. It feels like we're starting from scratch. And so this is a direct response to those questions about, well, how did we come to this place where it feels like we're starting to do social science, in some cases for the first time, or at least that those relationships feel so new. Brings me to these two main research questions. What is the scale and scope of social science contributions focused on lobster industries of Maine and Atlantic Canada since 1970 up through 2023, because we did this work in 2024. And then also who is doing what in current social science research, and how can we think about these things together, the histories and the active research. To start answering this question, we went back to the books. We did a systematic literature review. It's the least sexy thing you could possibly present on in these kinds of things, but super important because you know that this is the foundation of work that we're all building on in the social science realm in this space. We have to go back and understand what's been done. We started with a covenants review, which is this fancy platform that allows two people to review each citation that you have to make sure that it meets the inclusion criteria that you're using. So it's a really rigorous process where we took 1,548 references pulled from a number of sources that I'll talk about, and we whittled it down to 249 that really focus on this particular place. Social science in this context is really used to describe the study of people and their life context, so it's inclusive of many fields. We use keyword searches that tried to draw out the full range of social science disciplines of econ and anthro and indigenous knowledge and all these kinds of things. In terms of the inclusion criteria themselves, we focused on three main things. One, they had to fit within this time range, obviously. They had to fit within Maine and Atlantic Canada as a primary focus. And then, of course, they had to answer questions about the people and life context of folks involved with lobster fishing. Now, these are quite strict in some ways, right? So there's a ton of fisheries literature in social science that perhaps uses the Maine lobster industry as a small example, or references, fisheries in Atlantic Canada very broadly with lobster as one of 20 species. We really focused on papers that their primary questions were in these criteria. And so if we saw mentions of these criteria, data related to these things in the abstract and then the discussion, we took that to be, this is a primary focus of that paper, right? And then in terms of data sources, I'll just quickly note that we used Google Scholar because one of the goals for this was to include as many student theses and gray literature as possible, and that's been cited as the strongest search engine to do that kind of crawling. We also searched places like the NOAA Institutional Library Repository. There's like a couple of different DFO and Canadian federal libraries that are used for this. So we were trying to be more inclusive and broad rather than exclusive in the initial search. And what we found, starting in the top right corner here, is that there's been a dramatic increase in time in social science focused on lobster in these places during this time. Right? In the 1970s, that first category in the bottom, 1970 to 1975, Maine, the state of Maine, invested heavily in this whole series of economic reports that are fascinating. They were talking about how different sort of loan programs impacted management, impacted fishers' lives. And then it kind of dropped off, and you see this sort of steadier trend that's pretty comparable across Maine and Atlantic Canada in terms of those areas as the focus of the paper. The top 10 publishers of papers of this 249 included 7 academic journals and 3 universities. The top authors included, the top 3 were folks from Maine. There's a couple of really prolific authors like James Acheson, you might have heard of him in this area, who sort of dominate that top area. And then there's many Canadians in the top 10 as well. And interestingly, I would say too, there's this divide in really who's publishing. 288 one-time authors put forward something during this time period on lobster. A lot of those are probably student theses, right? There's another slide we'll get to that shows the rise in student focus on the lobster industry. But there's also this group of people, 58 people who weren't in the top 10, who published 2 to 4 papers over time. That's a remarkably kind of large body of folks who have some rotating interest in lobster. And shows that there's commitment. They probably publish on many other things as well, but this is a theme and a topic that they come back to. Top one? Yeah, okay. The top one here just really hammers home these 2 big groups of people who are involved in publishing in some form, the top being student theses, and you'll see relatively low numbers in the early 1970s. Starting around 2001, there start to be 3 or 4, every year from both folks focused on Atlantic Canada and in Maine. And then in 2011 and in 2021 to 2023, there's this massive jump in attention from people who were publishing from Canadian universities, which is fascinating. And so this kind of information really just tells us about what infrastructure, what support changed during that time where people are suddenly having this focus, and what does that mean for future transition into workforce capacity of these students who are building up knowledge through their master's and their graduate degrees on this industry. The government publications are also somewhat interesting. Again, you can see this, deluge in the 1970s from Maine. But it's a pretty steady, sort of gradual incline and then plateau of government focus on these. Is essentially one or maybe a report every other year from a government agency in these places. And you'll notice that there's some differences among your class, but again, it's not hugely differential among Canada and Maine. There is a really wide range of methods included in social science. The prominent one is some sort of review paper, so meaning they're using existing knowledge and compiling it in some way to make a new argument or talk about something new. There's also a large reliance on the sort of classic methods of social science, of interviews and observations, of surveys, that sort of work. And then down at the end, though, you'll see there's a number of creative methods that people are trying out, asking people to map things, asking people to take videos, to draw maps of their fishing grounds. Two-eyed seeing shows up in one of the Canadian papers. So there's examples of innovation in the research over time. And I would say, too, that the low numbers, so this isn't in a graph necessarily, but one of the other things that I looked at is really where people's attention were focused in this paper. And there's a relatively low number of these 249 papers that focused on cross-border studies, 13 out of 249. That's some, that's not nothing, right? But definitely some. And also, because of my own sort of selfish interest in youth for my own dissertation work, I looked back and was trying to understand how people referenced youth in this literature. And 28 mentions of youth in any form, so I was incredibly inclusive. I was just saying, did they talk about implications? Did they talk to youth at all? Did it show up? And so, again, some, but it tells us about the sort of focus of this work overall. And then I got to this stage where I was trying really hard to think about, okay, well, how do we understand what fields people are coming from? And I began to realize that it was going to be incredibly difficult to divvy up the fields because people did such interdisciplinary work. And very few people sit there in their paper and identify themselves as economists purely. So I switched to this focus on knowledge contributions for the paper. In their discussion and in their conclusion section, what were they claiming to have contributed to the social science of lobstering in general? And I came up with these 4 broad themes after reviewing the 249 papers. These are not rigid. There are obviously instances where a paper talked about more than one of these, but I attempted to categorize them and code them from the bottom-up process of their primary contribution. Governance and management includes all those things related to access and rights, evaluation of different management decisions, outcomes, all the theories of co-management that are really sort of strong in the social science literature. The economy, labor, and industry structure piece encompasses the fleet characteristics, fishing effort, marketing and supply chain insights, how people run their businesses and how they want to. The knowledge systems and justice piece, there's this whole section of papers that really talk about comparing scientific knowledge and local knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge in some form. What does it look like to work together across knowledges and research paradigms? And to think through those conundrums and the tensions and that kind of knowledge making and the differences of those through the lens of justice. And then finally, fishing culture, place, and identity, and this was really encompassing community and individual identity making. And so you'll see that governance was the most common theme. The other 3 are listed there, and there were some differences between Canada and Maine in the focus. Both governance for the first one, knowledge systems was more of a focus for folks writing about Atlantic Canada, whereas in Maine it was much more that business side of things, the structure, the industry, the fishing effort, and then a few differences in the bottom 2 as well, but I'm going to skip ahead for time. Some implications of this relative balance of publications in total. There's a huge growth of student research. There's also a really wide range of publication sources, which is great. There's 158 individual places that people were publishing their work, which is a wonderful breadth. And also it means that there may not be concentrated forums through which social scientists are having conversations. Little cross-border research, like I mentioned. I'm going to skip ahead quickly to the survey here, potentially. Other considerations. This question of who is doing what manifested itself in the second part of the research I'm talking about. It was a 12-question Google form survey that we sent out to as many people as we could who had published, who we had contact information for from the literature review, and also that we had contacts for directly through the Canadian Lobster Research Network and through folks at the Lobster Institute. We had 31 respondents, 17 Canadian, 14 in the US. And we also had we put together a story map so you can see where people are working. It's just useful. There's keywords included in this and contact information for most folks who wanted to contribute it. So you can, if you're a social scientist who's interested in being added to this, There's a form link at the very end as well, and you can add yourself and see what folks are doing. There's a lot of overlap in what people are focused on. So this is basically, this is based on purely the survey response, right? All of these keywords are what people listed, kind of summarized. And then you can see that there's overlap between the US and Canadian social scientists who are active in the field right now. So it's interesting. Room for collaboration, food for thought of how we can work together. And then just a quick comparison of the overlap between the literature review and the survey is just that the governance and management side of things really dominated in the literature, but when you look at the survey, the keywords and the way people were describing their work was actually much broader, which is interesting. And so maybe that's a feature of new folks coming into the industry, gearing up to publish. Maybe it's a feature of how people describe their work versus what they publish. How can we support students? 7 of the folks who fill out the survey are active grad students who are trying to make careers in this field in some form. And so just to plug this as an opportunity for us to reflect on what kind of institutional support we have there. And then using this as a breadth of knowledge to really compare. The CLRN has done a great job, and others, the Lobster Institute, there's these really concentrated areas where we're asking people, what do fishers care about? And we have now this kind of, baseline of what we see researchers caring about. How do those two align? And I'm definitely out of time, so I'm going to stop there and say thanks.
Thank you. I really need to read that. When you have the paper, I'd love to read it. My question is actually, I wonder if you mapped out the network of co-authors and then how that's maybe changing over time or not changing over time.
That's a great question. I haven't done the bibliometric network of this, but I think it would be totally possible. We have the data aligned for it. And there's certainly people who are such clear strongholds that I can imagine the clusters and like the lineages of academic work together would be really revealing. So yes, great question.
Any other questions?
This is probably me coming from more of a, like, the biology side of things.
Yeah.
Some of your figures on like when this research was occurring, like taking a quick glance at it seems really similar to landings growth in certain areas. So I wasn't sure if you had looked at like, how is the fishery doing economically? Like, there's a lot of people, like it's grown, there's more people in it versus how much research is going on there. Is there some connection?
100%. I think there is. Anecdotally, I would say that we chose this date range because the 1970s was a marked shift and upswing in lobster landings for this whole region, right? 1978 was the first comprehensive management plan for lobster in the US. 1978 was also the year that Nova Scotia did a buyback of 1,500 licenses as a way to protect the fishery. So we did set the range really intentionally to try to capture some of those big changes. And I would say that the government publications in some ways are a really good indication, and then the academic publication is almost like a latent thing that like a couple, 3 years after one of the big economic reports comes out, people are prompted to do follow-up research in some way. But that's another good, I can imagine taking a couple of really like key time points in the industry and talking about how many government publications were referenced it or came out right after. That would be really interesting. That's a great question.
More time for questions?
One from here. Homegrown.
Of course. You can do anything now.
I was just curious, if I understood correctly, the review included published academic and government research. And I'm just curious if you have reflections on how to tease into the data for unpublished research that is happening among various different organizations, extension programs, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's a lot of applied work that we know is going on. I'm just curious if you could reflect on, like, how do we tease that out?
This does include that.
Okay, cool.
It attempts to include it. It's often much harder. So doing the lit review for like how to do a systematic review, finding gray literature in a way that is actually comprehensive of what's been published is the place that people fail most commonly, I would say. So we use Google Scholar because it's the most likely, they use a different kind of index crawling that makes it more likely for you to get things from Sea Grant. So there are many NOAA publications and Sea Grant and kind of community-oriented publications that are captured in this, as well as the student theses, which are often unpublished in academic journals. So we captured a huge range of those kinds of documents. But I know there's things that we missed from states and provincial level type stuff that just never quite made it up. So talking about that like uncertainty of how reflected this is of the full body is definitely important.
Oh, sorry. You're the last question. Wee.
I was just wondering if you think there's any connection between like the keywords that are coming up in the literature and like what these countries are like funding in terms of research opportunities, because what struck me immediately is like a lot of the things on the Canadian side are like health and well-being, and like they are a place that has universal health care, and so I'm like, obviously I don't know much about what the Canadian funding environment looks like, but if you think there's any like connection there.
100%. That's not something that I like quantified or sought out as like, changes in funding over time during this time, but the focus on health and well-being, and also one of the biggest differences that you see in the literature, I would say, is the impact of the Marshall Decision and indigenous fisheries in Atlantic Canada as opposed to Maine. That conversation is just in vastly different places in these two areas. And so a lot of the publications that talk about knowledge and talk about justice are from that Canadian side, really thinking about what it looks like to have moderate livelihood fishing, what kind of fisheries justice and blue justice conversations can be had there. And I think it's because there's funding, there's opportunity for that, and there's institutional support for that for sure. So I think you're right. That's another thing that it would be fun to tie in at least a couple of particular points in any paper that I write of, downturns in the fishery and response to publications, and also like upturns in funding or critical support for researchers working on this.